He was only 9 years old when everything changed. Michael had been living on the cold streets of New York City since he was 5, when he lost his mother to an illness that had no name and for which there was no money for treatment. He slept in damp cardboard boxes under awnings, shared scraps of food with rats in the alleys of Union Square, and woke up every morning not knowing if he would survive until nightfall. His frail body bore the scars of a stolen childhood. His dark eyes held a sadness far too ancient for a child. To the world that rushed past him on the sidewalks, he was invisible, just another dirty boy, holding out a hand for coins that never came. But on a cold August night in 2024, at 10:47 p.m., this invisible boy did something no one would expect from an abandoned child. He risked his own life, placing his fragile body between violence and a stranger, protecting with his own hands a homeless man who was being beaten by 3 men in the dark confines of Dawson Alley. Michael had nothing to offer, no weapon, no strength, no advantage, only the inexplicable courage of a child who still believed that doing the right thing mattered. While well-dressed adults walked past the alley's entrance and turned their heads, pretending not to see the brutality happening just a few feet away, a 9-year-old boy decided he would not be another coward. And when the truth was finally revealed, when the world discovered who the homeless man Michael had shielded with his own body really was, everything changed. The cameras arrived, the journalists arrived, the questions arrived, and with them came the shocking revelation. The man on the ground was not just any vagrant. He was Robert Anderson, the billionaire owner of Anderson Holdings, one of the country's largest corporate groups. He'd been in disguise, testing people's humanity for 30 days, waiting for someone, anyone, to show a shred of compassion without expecting a reward. And of the 847 people who passed him in those 30 days, only one stopped. A 9-year-old child who had absolutely nothing decided to give everything he had, his safety, his physical integrity, and nearly his life. This is the true story of how courage doesn't depend on age, a bank account, or the clothes you wear, but on the choice we make when no one is watching and nothing compels us to act. It's the story of how an invisible boy exposed the hypocrisy of an entire society, revealing that the truly wealthy are not those with money in the bank, but those with humanity in their hearts. Before we continue with this story that will keep you hooked until the very end, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. And comment below where you're watching from, because we love to know that this message is reaching hearts across the United States and the world. Now take a deep breath, because what you're about to discover will make you question everything you think you know about courage, wealth, and the true value of a human being. Let's start with the most brutal scene. The moment Michael was on the ground, bleeding, shielding an unconscious stranger with his frail body, as 3 violent men prepared to deliver the final blow. Blood was trickling from Michael's mouth. His nose was broken, his fractured ribs ached with every breath, but he did not move from atop that body. It was a Thursday, 10:47 p.m., and Dawson Alley was plunged into the kind of darkness typical of areas the city forgets to light. The smell of accumulated garbage mixed with the metallic odor of blood staining the broken pavement, and the biting August cold made each breath a small agony for the boy trembling on the ground. The aggressor's shouts echoed off the peeling brick walls, mingling with the distant sound of traffic on Park Avenue, that artery of wealth pulsating just a few blocks away, indifferent to the violence unfolding in its shadows. Michael could hear the sound of sirens in the distance, but he knew no one would come in time. No one ever did. "Why are you doing this, kid?" yelled Marcus, the leader of the attackers, a 32-year-old man with a history of violence and eyes devoid of any trace of empathy. Michael didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because his mouth was full of blood and his words were lost in muffled whimpers of pain. He just held the unconscious man beneath him tighter, as if his determination could create an invisible shield against the kicks that kept coming. In his pain-fragmented mind, Michael remembered the words of Old Man Joe, the elderly homeless man who had taken him in. "Mikey, people like us only have one thing the rich can't buy, our dignity." And there, in that alley forgotten by God and by men, a 9-year-old boy was proving that dignity has no price and that courage depends not on the size of your body, but on the size of your heart. How many well-dressed people with full wallets and full bellies had passed by that same alley in the last 2 hours and looked away? How many adults with double, triple, 10 times Michael's physical strength chose the safety of indifference over the vulnerability of compassion? Why did a hungry child with no home, no family, no anything have more humanity than hundreds of adults who had everything? These questions would echo in the national news in the coming weeks. But at that moment, only one truth mattered. Michael chose to be human when being human was the most dangerous thing in the world. The darkness of the alley was broken only by the faint light of a distant lamppost, creating grotesque shadows that danced on the walls as the violence unfolded like a macabre play. The boy's fragile body trembled not just from the cold, but from pure, visceral fear, that primal fear that screams at you to run, to survive, to abandon strangers and save yourself. But something stronger than fear held Michael in that place. The memory of the kindness Old Man Joe had shown him, the stubborn, childish belief that the world could still be a place where doing the right thing mattered. The contrast was brutal and poetic, the innocence of a child colliding with adult brutality, purity confronting corruption, hope defying cynicism. On that cold August night, in a New York City that prides itself on its skyscrapers but forgets its most vulnerable citizens, a 9-year-old child proved that courage is priceless, that the truly wealthy are those who still have a heart, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are the smallest, the weakest, the most forgotten. And if this truth makes you uncomfortable, if this story makes you question how many times you've turned your face away to avoid seeing the suffering of others, then leave a like so that more people are confronted with this reality we prefer to ignore. Because Michael wasn't exceptional for being brave, he was exceptional for doing what we all should do, choosing humanity even when it costs everything. But to fully understand why that night happened the way it did, we need to go back 2 weeks, to the days leading up to the moment Michael would become a household name across the country. 15 days before the incident, on an August morning that was just as cold but less dramatic, Michael woke up in his home, a refrigerator box strategically placed under the awning of a closed shop in Union Square. The routine was always the same. Awaken with his body aching from the cold and the hard ground, check to see if anyone had stolen his only belongings, a plastic water bottle and a thin donated blanket, and start the day begging for change from hurried passers-by. Michael was 9, but he looked 6 due to the chronic malnutrition that stunted his body and delayed his growth. His brown hair was matted and dirty, forming impossible knots that he had long since given up trying to comb with his fingers. The clothes he wore were a t-shirt 3 sizes too big, donated by some church with the faded logo of a brand he couldn't even read, and a pair of ripped shorts that had once been blue, but were now an indefinite color between gray and brown. His bare feet had calluses as thick as leather, adapted to 4 years of walking on hot summer asphalt and icy winter concrete. Michael's story truly began 5 years earlier, when he was just 4, and his mother, Joanna, worked as a cleaner in 3 houses to support them both in a shack in the Bronx. Joanna fell ill with something the clinic doctors could never properly diagnose because they never had the time or resources to investigate adequately, and within 3 months she was dead, leaving Michael alone in the world with no known family. His father had never been present. The name on his birth certificate was Father Unknown, and the only Aunt Joanna ever mentioned lived somewhere down south with no full address or last name. Michael was sent to a shelter for 6 months, ran away when the conditions became unbearable, and the street had been his home ever since. His motivations were primitive and brutally honest in their survivalist rawness. Wake up, find food, avoid violence, survive until night, sleep, and repeat. There was no room for big dreams, like becoming a football player or studying medicine. His main goal was to get enough food to not go to sleep with his stomach churning from hunger, and maybe, on lucky days, find a relatively safe place to spend the night without being woken up by kicks or curses. Michael's world was small, brutal, and honest. He was invisible to society, and he had learned to accept this invisibility as a part of life. But 2 weeks before the incident that would change everything, something different happened in Michael's monochrome routine. He met Old Man Joe, a 67-year-old homeless man with a scraggly white beard, kind eyes despite the hardness of life, and a history as a former factory worker who lost everything when the factory closed and his family fell apart. Joe had been living on the streets of downtown New York for 15 years, and over that time he had formed what he called his street family, a group of vulnerable people who helped each other, sharing food, protecting one another, and trying to preserve a shred of dignity in a world that insisted on dehumanizing them. When Joe saw Michael, a boy so small and so alone, something paternal stirred in him. "Come here, Mikey," Joe had called one morning, holding out half a bagel he got from a bakery. "You all alone out here, son? Where's your family?" Michael explained with the traumatic simplicity of a child accustomed to loss, that he had no family, that his mother had died, that he'd been alone for 4 years. Joe shook his head sadly, but then smiled with that worn-out kindness of someone who has suffered greatly but refused to lose his humanity. "Well, now you've got family again, you hear me? Me lords, James, we're gonna look after you." And so began the bond that 2 weeks later would lead Michael to risk everything. Joe spent those 2 weeks teaching Michael about street dignity, as he called it. "Mikey, listen to me. We don't have a house, we don't have money, we don't have anything the world thinks is important. But people like us, we have one thing the rich can't buy with all their millions: our dignity. Never lose that, kid. No matter how much they step on you, ignore you, treat you like trash, you never stop being human. You understand?" Michael listened with the ancient seriousness of children who grow up too fast, absorbing every word as if memorizing a survival map. These words would echo in his mind on the night in the alley. The backdrop for Michael's new life was downtown New York, specifically the area from Union Square to the outskirts of Park Avenue, that artery of obscene wealth, where executives in $3,000 suits walked just feet away from children begging for coins. The contrast was so brutal, it became almost performative. 40-story mirrored buildings reflecting the blue sky, while their ground floors sheltered homeless people sleeping on cardboard. Designer stores selling $10,000 handbags, while 2 blocks away, people rummaged through trash for food. There were unique elements to this geography of inequality, the invisible community of the homeless that everyone saw but no one looked at, creating networks of solidarity that worked better than many structured families. Michael's street family included memorable characters who formed a constellation of forgotten humanity. Lourdes, 54, a former domestic worker who lost her job when she got sick and could no longer work, had a maternal smile that calmed Michael on difficult days and always saved some leftover food to share with her kids, as she called Michael and other homeless youths. James, 15, a tall, skinny teenager who ran away from home after years of abuse, took on the role of a protective older brother, teaching Michael the safe places to sleep and the times when certain shops threw out still edible food. Together, they formed an imperfect but real family. But not everything on the street was about bonds of solidarity. There were also very real and very dangerous antagonists. The primary opposing force was indifferent society itself, That mass of people who rushed past, staring at their phones, who crossed the street when they saw a homeless person, who wrinkled their noses as if poverty were contagious. But there were also more concrete secondary antagonists, a group of 3 criminals led by Marcus, 32, a violent man with a history of assault who terrorized the homeless to steal their few belongings and established territorial dominance over certain areas. And there was the most insidious tertiary antagonistic force, the system that systematically failed to protect vulnerable children, allowing a 9-year-old boy to live on the streets for 4 years without effective intervention. Life on the streets has its own rhythm, a cadence of survival that repeats with almost ritualistic precision until something breaks the routine and everything falls apart. For Michael and his new street family, that break came on a Thursday, exactly 1 week before the incident that would put the boy on the national news. It was around 9:30 p.m. when Michael was sitting on a piece of cardboard next to Old Man Joe, sharing a cold meal the old man had gotten from a church that distributed food on Thursdays. The sky was overcast, threatening rain, and the August chill cut through the thin clothes they both wore. That's when 3 men emerged from the darkness of the alley, walking with the predatory arrogance of those who know they can do whatever they want because no one will defend their victims. The leader was Marcus, a 32-year-old man standing 6'1", with muscles built from working out in prison during the 6 years he spent locked up for robbery and assault, and eyes that looked like broken glass, empty of any trace of empathy or remorse. Beside him were Jefferson, 28, thin but fast, known for throwing punches before asking questions, and Rick, 25, the youngest but no less cruel, who always carried a knife hidden at his waist. They were collecting a toll, as they called the act of robbing the homeless and establishing territorial control over certain parts of downtown, chasing off anyone who didn't pay with belongings, food, or simply by accepting humiliation without fighting back. Michael felt Joe's body stiffen beside him, saw the old man's trembling hands clutch the styrofoam container as if trying to protect a treasure. "Well, well, old man," Marcus had said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Eating good, huh? Must have a little extra for us, right?" Joe tried to keep his voice steady, but Michael could feel the fear radiating from him like sweat. "This is all I have today, mister. It's not even enough for me, let alone to share." The response was swift and brutal. Jefferson snatched the container from Joe's hands with such force that the old man fell sideways, his shoulder hitting the ground with a dull thud that made Michael choke on his own fear. Rick laughed, a metallic, empty sound. "Learn your place, old man. This area is ours. You want to stay here? Then you pay, you got it?" Whether it's with food, money, or respect, Michael was frozen, hiding behind Joe, his small body trembling not just from the cold, but from a primal terror that screamed at him to run, to flee, to disappear. He watched Marcus turn the container upside down, dumping the rice and beans onto the dirty sidewalk, deliberately stomping on the food that represented Joe's only meal of the day. "Next time I come by," Marcus said, leaning down to get in Joe's face, "you better have something for me. Otherwise, it won't be just your food I'll be stepping on. You understand, old-timer?" Joe nodded silently, too humiliated to speak, and the 3 men walked away laughing, disappearing into the alley like satisfied predators returning to their dens. That night marked the beginning of something new in Michael's consciousness, a dull revolt growing like a seed planted in the fertile soil of injustice. "Why do the weak always get beat up by the even weaker?" he asked Joe as he helped the old man up, feeling the hot tears of anger and powerlessness burn his childish eyes. Joe had no answer, just shaking his head with the heavy sadness of someone who had seen this scene repeat itself hundreds of times over 15 years on the streets. They went to sleep hungry that night, but the physical hunger was less than the hunger for dignity. that burning desire for the world to be minimally fair, for vulnerable people not to be constantly trampled on just because they could be trampled on without consequence. The following days were marked by nightmares that woke Michael in the middle of the night, his small body convulsing in fear as he mentally replayed the scene of Joe's humiliation. During the day, he began to obsessively watch the alley where the incident occurred, identifying patterns with the sharp attention that street kids develop as a survival mechanism. He noticed that the group returned every Thursday around the same time, as if making a weekly round to collect their territorial toll. Michael felt a paralyzing fear growing inside him, but he couldn't forget Joe's defeated look, the expression of a man who had lost not just food, but something more precious, the last vestige of safety and dignity. The situation worsened when Michael discovered, through conversations with other homeless people, that Marcus's group was becoming progressively more violent and bold. Lourdes, the 54-year-old mother figure who always had a gentle smile for Michael, showed up 3 days later with a bruised and swollen face, the result of an assault she initially tried to hide, but which became impossible to disguise. "Was it them?" Michael asked in a choked voice, and Lourdes just nodded, unable to speak about the humiliation she suffered when she refused to hand over a blanket a church had donated. She spent 2 days in a public hospital being treated for a mild concussion and returned even more frightened, with the look of a cornered animal that has learned there is no safe place. Other homeless people began to disappear from the area, migrating to more distant neighborhoods where Marcus's group had not yet established control, and this created a void in the community that once offered some collective comfort in shared misery. No one reported the assailants for fear of retaliation, knowing the police rarely patrolled that area properly, and that even if they did, they would hardly take complaints from vagrants against upstanding citizens seriously without reliable witnesses or concrete evidence. The system was structurally indifferent to the suffering of those who were already invisible, and this indifference created zones of impunity where violence thrived unchecked. Michael began to seriously question whether he should flee the area, find another neighborhood, another alley, another awning where he could sleep without the constant terror of being the next victim. But there was a problem. Old Man Joe was getting sick. After the humiliation, the old man stopped eating properly, became depressed, and started coughing in a worrying way that made his thin body tremble. Michael felt responsible for caring for the man who had taken him in when he had no one, the old man who had shared food and taught him about dignity. How could he abandon him now? How could he run away and leave Joe alone to face the next Thursday, the next round from Marcus and his cronies? The growing tension was palpable among the homeless who remained in the area, as if everyone knew something worse was coming, but no one had the courage or resources to stop it. James, the 15-year-old who had taken on the role of Michael's older brother, tried to organize some kind of collective resistance, suggesting they all stand together when Marcus showed up. But most were too afraid or too weak to confront violent, physically superior men. And so, as the following Thursday approached like a descending guillotine, Michael faced a dilemma no 9-year-old should ever face: accept impotence and learn to live with normalized injustice, or do something, anything, even if it cost him everything. Thursday arrived with the heavy inevitability of a fate you cannot avoid, no matter how hard you try. It brought with it a grey sky that threatened rain but never delivered, only keeping a cold dampness clinging to the skin like an extra layer of discomfort. Michael woke up earlier than usual, around 6 p.m., as the August sun was already setting and the city's artificial lights began to replace the natural daylight. His stomach churned, not just from hunger, but from an anticipatory anxiety that made his hands tremble as he helped Old Man Joe arrange his spot on the cardboard. The old man was worse, coughing more frequently, moving with the slowness of someone who is sick but doesn't have the luxury of resting. "It's Thursday," Michael said quietly, more to himself than to Joe, and the old man just nodded with the heavy resignation of someone who has accepted that bad things happen and there's nothing to be done. The hours passed with the torturous slowness that occurs when you're waiting for something bad, each minute stretching like an elastic band about to snap. Michael positioned himself strategically near Dawson Alley, the same one where Joe had been humiliated a week before, watching from a distance but staying close enough to intervene if what? What exactly could a 9-year-old boy weighing 65 pounds with zero physical strength do against 3 violent men? He didn't know, but something inside him, some mix of loyalty, childish stubbornness, and Joe's words about dignity, kept him planted there like an impromptu sentinel. Around 9 p.m., Michael heard rumors circulating among the homeless. "They said they're going to teach a lesson to anyone who stays in their territory," whispered Lourdes, her voice full of fear. "Said they're going to make an example of someone." But when 9:30 p.m. arrived and the group finally appeared in the alley, something was different. Something Michael hadn't expected and which completely changed the script for the night. Marcus, Jefferson, and Rick were there, walking with the same predatory arrogance as always, but the victim they surrounded was not Joe, as Michael had feared, but a man he had never seen in the area before. The man was dressed like someone homeless, torn, dirty clothes, an old jacket with indefinite stains, worn-out sneakers with separating soles. But there was something about him that was strange, something Michael couldn't name but felt instinctively. His clothes were dirty, yes, but the type of dirt seemed intentional, recent. And despite the unshaven beard and disheveled hair, the man carried himself with an erect posture, a kind of bodily confidence that people long on the streets lose. Michael hid behind a dumpster about 50 feet away, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it echoing in the silent alley. It was then that he saw a detail his childish brain registered, but didn't fully process until much later: the man's hands. Despite being covered in grease and dirt, his fingernails were well kept, trimmed with the precision that comes from a professional manicure, not from nervous biting or the neglect of the streets. Michael blinked, confused, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but he had no time to process it, because at that moment, Marcus and his cronies surrounded the man, forming a predatory triangle from which there was no escape. "Well, well, new guy," Marcus said with that empty smile. "Think you can just set up here for free? This area has an owner, you get it?" What happened next was the strangest and most shocking moment Michael would witness until the final confrontation. The man did not react with fear. As Jefferson shoved his shoulder hard and Rick circled behind him, the stranger just watched with the unnerving calm of someone observing a science experiment rather than being the victim of an imminent assault. His eyes, and Michael would never forget this detail, were piercing, analytical, evaluating every move of the aggressors as if he were taking mental notes. There was no terror, no pleading, just a cold, clinical observation that sent a shiver down Michael's spine. "I have nothing," the man said in a calm, almost monotone voice. "You can check." Marcus seemed momentarily thrown by the lack of fear, but quickly recovered his aggressive persona. "Oh yeah? Well, I guess we'll have to teach you some respect." The violence began with Jefferson landing the first punch to the stranger's stomach, a blow strong enough to double over any normal person, but the man only faltered slightly, shielding his face with his arms, but not attempting to flee or fight back. Michael watched in horror from his hiding place as the 3 men escalated the assault punches to the ribs, kicks to the legs, shouted profanities that echoed through the empty alley. And during all this, at least a dozen people walked past the entrance to the alley. Some even paused briefly to look at the scene, but every single one of them, without exception, continued on their way. A woman with shopping bags from an expensive store quickened her pace. A man in a suit averted his gaze, as if seeing something too obscene to process. A young couple commented on something in a low voice and laughed nervously before disappearing into the crowd. It was in that moment, watching that collective indifference as a human being was beaten just feet away from well-fed, safe pedestrians, that something inside Michael broke. A burning rage, different from the paralyzing fear he felt before, began to swell in his small chest, like a fire feeding on oxygen. He remembered Joe saying, "Our dignity is all we have." And he realized that to watch this without doing anything would be to lose that dignity, to become as empty as those people who walked by, pretending not to see. If I do nothing, Michael thought with the sharp clarity that sometimes comes in the most critical moments, I'm just like them. I'm just like those people who walk by and pretend they don't see, and then I become nothing. The 9-year-old child who had nothing, who was invisible to the world, decided in that moment that he would rather be visible and vulnerable than invisible and a coward. And if this story has you hooked, if it's making you question how many times you've looked away from someone's suffering, leave a like so that more people can be confronted with this uncomfortable truth. Because what Michael was about to do would not only change his life, but expose the hypocrisy of an entire society. Michael looked around for something, anything he could use, and saw an empty glass bottle near the dumpster. His hands were shaking so much he almost dropped the bottle as he picked it up, but he managed to grip it, feeling the cold weight of the glass in his small palm. His heart was racing so fast he could barely breathe, his mind screaming, "Run, get away, you're going to die." But his legs, those skinny legs that walked miles every day begging for alms, began to move toward the alley. The decision was impulsive, unplanned, the kind of choice that happens when the body acts before the brain has time to calculate the fatal consequences. Michael ran toward the aggressors, screaming with all the force his small lungs could muster. "Leave him alone! Leave him alone!" His voice was high-pitched, childish, almost ridiculous in its disproportion to the situation, but it had the desired effect. The 3 men turned, startled by the interruption. Michael didn't think, he just acted, throwing the glass bottle with all his might at Jefferson's back. The bottle hit and shattered, causing no real damage, but creating enough confusion and distraction to pause the violence. And it was in that pause, in that split-second opening, that Michael's eyes met the eyes of the stranger on the ground. What Michael saw in those eyes confused him completely. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't relief, but an intense curiosity, as if the man were observing Michael in the same way he observed the attackers, as if they were all part of an experiment whose outcome he was eager to discover. But Michael had no time to process this because Marcus, Jefferson and Rick were now turning fully toward him, temporarily forgetting the stranger and focusing all their attention and fury on the stupid kid who dared to intervene. "You stupid kid!" Marcus snarled with a rage that made Michael's stomach drop. "You just signed your own death warrant. We're gonna teach you not to stick your nose where it doesn't belong." And as the 3 men advanced toward Michael, the boy realized with crystal clarity that he had made either the most foolish or the most courageous decision of his life, and that perhaps they were one and the same. The first blow struck Michael's face with a force that sent the entire world spinning, the colors blurring into a nauseating smear of pain and confusion. Jefferson, the quickest of the 3, had landed a direct punch on the boy's nose. Michael felt the thin bone crack under the man's knuckles, followed immediately by a hot gush of blood that streamed over his upper lip and filled his mouth with the metallic taste of iron. The impact threw Michael backward, but he didn't fall completely, only staggered. In that moment of imbalance, Rick seized the opportunity to drive a kick into his ribs, knocking all the air from the boy's small lungs. Michael finally collapsed to his knees, coughing and spitting blood, seeing stars dance in his peripheral vision as his brain tried to process the sheer volume of pain his body was simultaneously experiencing. Through the haze of agony, Michael could see the stranger, the mysterious homeless man he was trying to save, still on the ground a few feet away, watching the scene with that same analytical and disconcerting expression. The man wasn't unconscious as Michael had initially thought. His eyes were wide open, piercing, assessing every movement with an intensity that seemed almost scientific. And it was in that moment of chaos and violence, as Marcus approached to deliver the next blow, that something fell from the stranger's pocket as he shifted slightly. It was an expensive leather wallet, the kind Michael saw in the pockets of executives rushing down Park Avenue, completely out of place in the grimy hands of a supposed homeless man. The wallet flipped open as it fell, and for a fraction of a second, Michael saw a flash of Goldcard, possibly a premium credit card or some kind of elite identification. Michael had no time to fully process what it meant, because Marcus then kicked him in the stomach with such force that the boy felt his breakfast, an old cracker lords had shared, surge up his throat mixed with bitter bile. But even through the paralyzing agony, even as his body screamed at him to curl into a fetal position and accept defeat, Michael remembered Old Man Joe's words, "Our dignity is all we have." If he gave up now, if he abandoned that man on the ground, whoever he really was, Michael would lose the one thing that still made him human amidst the dehumanization of the street. So, with a determination that defied all logic of self-preservation, the 9-year-old boy dragged himself across the blood-stained ground toward the stranger's body. "Why don't you just stop, kid?" Marcus shouted, genuinely confused by the suicidal stubbornness of this child who insisted on protecting a stranger. "He's nothing to you. He's just another useless bum. Why are you doing this?" Michael didn't answer because he couldn't form words through the blood and pain, but his body answered for him. He managed to reach the stranger and literally threw himself on top of him, using his small, broken body as a human shield. It was a gesture absurd in its futility. What could a 65-pound boy do against 3 violent grown men? But it was also a profoundly human gesture, the kind of irrational sacrifice that defines character more than any eloquent speech ever could. The kicks kept coming, now landing on Michael's back and legs, and each impact sent waves of agony through his already shattered body. His ribs fractured with dry cracks that he could hear echoing inside his own head. His broken nose throbbed with sharp pain at every accelerated heartbeat, and the taste of blood in his mouth became so intense he was sure he was bleeding internally. But still, Michael did not move from atop the stranger's body, pressing himself against him as if he could somehow absorb the violence before it reached the man beneath him. And it was in this moment of extreme sacrifice that the stranger finally spoke, his voice low but clear, whispering directly into Michael's ear, "Why are you doing this, son?" The question echoed in Michael's fragmented mind like a Zen riddle he had no mental capacity to solve in the midst of the violence. Why was he doing this? Because Joe taught him that dignity matters. Because he refused to be another indifferent coward like the dozen people who had walked past the alley. Because a stubborn, childish part of him still believed that doing the right thing had value even when it brought no reward. Michael couldn't formulate these answers philosophically, but his bleeding body had already given the most eloquent response possible. He was doing this because it was the right thing to do, and in a world that constantly tried to convince him that he didn't matter, proving that others mattered was his way of affirming his own humanity. Then the saving sound arrived, voices shouting from the other end of the alley, multiple familiar voices that made the attackers pause their assault. Old Man Joe appeared at the entrance to the alley, leaning on James, the 15-year-old teenager, and behind them came lords and at least 5 other homeless people who made up their makeshift family. "I've already called the police," Joe shouted with all the authority his frail body could muster. "They're on their way. You're going to jail." It was a lean-known of them had a phone to call the police, but it worked as a sufficient bluff to create hesitation. James started yelling too, making noise, drawing attention, breaking the veil of invisibility that allowed such violence to happen without witnesses who mattered. A woman passing on the street finally stopped upon hearing the growing commotion, saw the scene of a bleeding boy protecting a body, and screamed, "I'm calling the police, for real! This is outrageous." Her voice carried that tone of bourgeois indignation of someone finally forced to see something they would rather ignore. But it was enough. Marcus, Jefferson, and Rick realized the situation was spiraling out of control, that witnesses were accumulating, that their protective invisibility was being shattered. "This isn't over, kid," Marcus spat on the ground near Michael's face. "You signed your own death warrant." And then the three men fled into the darkness of the alley, disappearing like rats startled by a sudden light. Michael opened his eyes briefly, his vision blurred by blood and trauma, and saw the stranger's face looking directly at him from just inches away. There were tears in the man's eyes, real tears streaming down that dirty, bearded face, and an expression of something that looked like a mixture of admiration, shame, and reverence. "You're special, kid," the man whispered in a choked voice. "Very, very special. You did what no one else did. No one." Michael tried to respond, tried to ask who this man was, why he had a gold card in his wallet, why he didn't run when he had the chance, but the words wouldn't come. His consciousness was slipping away, the pain becoming distant and abstract. The sound of sirens in the distance, finally real ambulance sirens that someone had actually called. Joe ran over and knelt beside Michael, his old trembling hands gently touching the boy's bloodied face. "Mikey, my brave boy, hang in there, help is coming." Lourdes was crying openly, James was muttering curses at the attackers who had fled, and the other homeless people formed a protective circle around Michael, as if they could finally offer the protection that had come too late. The stranger sat up, his disguise still intact, but his eyes completely different now, transformed by the experience. Before Michael lost consciousness completely, he managed to form a single clear thought. "At least I did the right thing." And with that thought came a faint smile, the smile of a child who still believed in goodness in a brutal world. Michael awoke slowly, emerging from unconsciousness as if swimming through dark, viscous molasses. Each new layer of awareness brought a fresh wave of pain that made him want to sink back into the darkness. His eyes fluttered open with difficulty. His eyelids were heavy and swollen, and the first thing he registered was a white light, too bright, a light that hurt his eyes and made his head throb with a pulsing intensity. Gradually, his vision focused, and he realized he was in a room. This was definitely not a public hospital with its faded walls and the smell of cheap disinfectant, but a private room with soft, cream-colored walls, elegant curtains, and the discreet scent of expensive cleaning products. There was a flat-screen TV on the wall, a comfortable recliner, and a large window showing the sunlit New York skyline. He turned his head to the side, a movement that sent daggers of pain through his fractured ribs, and saw familiar faces. Old man Joe sat in the recliner, his eyes red from crying. Lourdes stood beside the bed, holding his hand with maternal gentleness. James leaned against the wall, his expression serious but relieved. And then there was the stranger, the homeless man Michael had protected, but he was completely transformed. The man was now cleaner, professionally trimmed beard, a neat haircut, wearing an expensive grey suit that probably cost more than everything everyone else in that room owned, combined. His eyes were the same, piercing and analytical, but now they held something more, a profound emotion that wasn't there before. Michael blinked, confused, his mind still foggy as he tried to process the transformation. "Who are you, sir?" The man approached the bed, moving with the posture of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms and making decisions that affect thousands of people. "My name is Robert Anderson," he said, his voice firm but thick with barely contained emotion. "I own Anderson Holdings, a corporate group with operations in construction, technology, and investments. It's worth approximately $2.4 billion. He paused, letting this absurd piece of information sink into Michael's confused mind. "I've spent the last 30 days posing as a homeless man, Michael. 30 days living on the streets of downtown New York, sleeping on cardboard, begging for change, being ignored and despised. It was a social experiment, if you want to call it that. A test." The word test echoed in the room with a heavy moral weight. Michael tried to sit up, but the pain in his ribs stopped him. He just turned his head to look at Robert, with the confusion of a child trying to grasp overly complex adult concepts. Robert continued, his voice growing more intense. "During those 30 days, I counted how many people walked past me when I needed help, when I was on the ground pretending to be unconscious, when I asked for food, when I was being kicked out of establishments. Do you know how many people stopped to genuinely help without expecting anything in return?" He let the question hang in the air, then answered in a broken voice. 847 people passed me in situations where any decent human being would stop to help. Do you know how many actually stopped? 0, not 1, until that night, until you. The revelation hit Michael like ice water, bringing a sudden, painful clarity that cut through the fog of pain and medication. So you let them beat me?" Michael's voice was small, childlike, carrying a sense of betrayal he could barely articulate. "You could have stopped it? You could have stopped them?" Robert closed his eyes, and when he opened them, tears were streaming down his face, real tears, from a man confronting the moral weight of his choices. "Yes," he admitted in a hoarse voice. "I have training in martial arts, a 3rd-degree black belt in jiu-jitsu. I could have neutralized those 3 men in under a minute, but I had to see, I had to know how far you would go, how far anyone would go." The silence that followed was so heavy, it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Michael felt hot tears burn his already swollen eyes, and he began to cry with the devastating honesty of a child who hasn't yet learned to hide his emotions. "So it was all a lie?" he sobbed between painful breaths. "I thought I was saving someone who needed it, but it was just a test. I almost died for a test." Old Man Joe stood up from the recliner, his own face contorted in outrage and horror. "How could you do that to a child? How?" Lord squeezed Michael's hand tightly, her maternal voice transformed into protective fury. "That's inhuman. He's 9 years old. 9! James pushed himself off the wall, his hands clenched into fists. "You're a monster. It doesn't matter how much money you have, you're a monster." Robert Anderson, the billionaire accustomed to being treated with reverence and deference, sank to his knees beside the hospital bed, his posture of power crumbling into visceral shame. "You're right," he said in a broken voice. "You're all completely right. What I did was indefensible, unforgivable. I put an innocent child in mortal danger to satisfy my own morbid curiosity about human nature." He looked directly at Michael, forcing himself to meet the betrayed and confused eyes of the child. "Michael, you have every right to be angry, furious. You should hate me, because what I did was use you as a guinea pig in a cruel experiment. But let me tell you what I learned." Robert took a deep breath, trying to control the emotion that threatened to shatter his voice completely. "In 30 days on the streets, wearing torn clothes and smelling bad, I learned more about humanity than I did in 20 years building a corporate empire. I learned that the poorest are the most generous. I learned that people like Joe, Lords, James people who have nothing will share the little they have without a second thought. Meanwhile, I saw executives who earn in a day what a homeless person won't see in a year walk past me as if I were invisible trash. And you, Michael," his voice broke, "you, A child who had absolutely nothing, who was hungry and vulnerable. You gave literally everything you had. Your safety, your physical integrity, almost your life. Michael looked at Robert through his tears, still processing, still trying to decide whether to forgive or hate this man who had endangered him, but now wept at his feet. Robert continued, "I was testing humanity. I wanted to prove my cynical theory that no one really cares about strangers, that everyone is selfish when the consequences are real. But you were the one who passed the test, Michael. You destroyed my theory. You proved that courage and compassion still exist, and the one who failed miserably was me, because a truly human being would never have let a child get hurt just to satisfy an intellectual curiosity. I am the monster James said I am." The room fell into a heavy silence. It was Old Man Joe, with his street wisdom and years of surviving the brutality of social indifference, who finally spoke. "You are a monster, yes, but at least you're a monster who knows he's a monster. That's something." He looked at Michael with kind but serious eyes. "Mikey, what this man did was wrong, very wrong, but what you did was right, and no one can take that away from you. You risked everything for a stranger. That makes you better than any billionaire." Robert nodded, accepting the judgment. "Joe is right. And Michael, I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I did, starting now, immediately." He pulled an envelope from the inner pocket of his expensive suit. "This is just the beginning." Robert Anderson opened the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, revealing documents printed on the expensive letterhead of law firms that likely charged more per hour than Michael saw in an entire year on the streets. "Michael," he began, his voice controlled but charged with determination, "I am creating an $800,000 trust fund in your name. The money will be available when you turn 18, but the earnings will be used to ensure your education, housing, and basic needs are met starting now." He paused, letting the absurdly generous information sink into the boy's still confused mind. "Additionally, I've already purchased a 2-bedroom apartment in a good neighborhood, deeded to a protective trust until you come of age. You will never sleep on the street again, Michael. Never again." But Robert didn't stop there, turning to Joe, Lourdes, and James with the intensity of a man accustomed to changing lives with a signature. "Joe, you will have an apartment as well, paid in full, with all expenses covered. And if you'll accept, I would like to offer you the position of manager at the homeless shelter I'm going to build in downtown New York. Lourdes, you will have guaranteed housing and comprehensive medical care to treat the health conditions that have been neglected for years. James, I will pay for your education and offer a vocational training program so you can choose whatever career you want to pursue." The generosity was so vast, so sudden, that the three of them stood in silence, processing whether this was real or some collective hallucination. Michael was still trying to grasp the scale of what was happening, his childish mind struggling to process numbers that made no sense, concepts like owning an apartment and trust fund that were completely abstract to someone who considered success to be finding enough food to not sleep hungry. "Why?" was all he could manage to ask, his voice small and choked. "Why are you doing this?" Robert closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, there was a rare vulnerability in a man used to projecting power and control. "Because you taught me something that Harvard, that all the business books, that 20 years of building an empire couldn't teach me, that true wealth isn't in what you have, but in who you are when no one is looking." Old Man Joe, with that street wisdom that cuts through rhetoric straight to the heart of the matter, shook his head slowly. "You're not doing this out of generosity," he said, not accusatorially, but with brutal honesty. "You're doing it because you feel guilty, because you know you used a child as a guinea pig and you need to clear your conscience." Robert didn't deny it, just nodded with a humility rare in billionaires. You are absolutely right, Joe. I am not the hero of this story. I am the villain trying to buy redemption. But even if my motivation is selfish, the result is real. Michael will have opportunities, all of you will, and if that assuages my guilt, then yes, I am selfish even in my repentance. The raw honesty disarmed the hostility in the room. Michael reflected, his mind still processing the trauma of the test and the confused gratitude for the unexpected reward, trying to find some moral clarity amidst the complicated grey of the situation. "I didn't save a rich man," he finally said, with the profound simplicity only children can articulate. "I saved a human being. It didn't matter if you were a beggar or a billionaire. It was the right thing to do." Those words, coming from a 9-year-old boy with a broken nose and fractured ribs, echoed in the private hospital room like a judgment more powerful than any court could deliver. Robert felt tears flowing freely now, without embarrassment, because that child had exposed the central truth he had tried to avoid. Character has no price, and all his fortune could not buy what Michael possessed naturally. The following weeks were a whirlwind of changes that left Michael dizzy, from the speed at which his life transformed, from a survival nightmare into something resembling the fairy tales he overheard snippets of when passing by bookstores. He spent 2 weeks in the private hospital, recovering from his injuries, a fractured nose that required surgery to set properly, 3 broken ribs that would take months to fully heal, and a mild concussion that required constant monitoring. But more important than the physical recovery was the psychological one. A therapist specializing in childhood trauma visited Michael 3 times a week, helping him process not only the violence he suffered, but the 4 years of neglect and invisibility that preceded that night in the alley. The story inevitably leaked to the media. It's impossible to keep a secret when a well-known billionaire is involved in something so dramatic and morally complex, and within 48 hours of the incident, Michael's face was on every national news broadcast. 9-year-old boy risks life for stranger, exposes social indifference. The headlines proclaimed, accompanied by photos of Michael in the hospital, that Robert had specifically authorized to force the public to confront the human cost of social invisibility. Heated debates erupted on social media and talk shows. Some praised Michael as an unlikely hero, others fiercely criticized Robert for endangering a child, and many, uncomfortable and defensive, questioned their own complicity in the everyday indifference that allows children to live on the streets without adequate intervention. The impact went far beyond the personal, creating ripples that reached public policy and collective consciousness in a way that surprised even Robert, with all his experience in public relations and influence. Non-profits working with the homeless population reported a 340% increase in donations in the 2 weeks after the story went public. The New York City government, pressured by the sudden scrutiny, announced a 50% expansion in shelter programs for vulnerable children. Robert used his considerable political and economic influence to lobby lawmakers, resulting in a bill that increased funding for social assistance and created more effective protection mechanisms for homeless minors. "Michael didn't just save my humanity," Robert said at a widely publicized press conference. "He exposed the moral bankruptcy of a society that allows thousands of invisible children to exist." 6 months after the incident that changed everything, on a sunny February morning, completely different from that cold August night, Michael sat in a classroom for the first time in his life, wearing a clean uniform and carrying a new backpack full of school supplies that still smelled of freshly manufactured plastic. He was tremendously behind, academically after all. He had spent 4 years on the streets with no formal education, but private tutors hired by Robert worked with him 3 hours a day to make up for lost time, and Michael discovered he had a natural aptitude, especially for math and history. The private school in his new neighborhood initially had reservations about accepting a student with such a different background, but a generous donation from Robert for the new library and pressure from progressive parents who saw an opportunity to teach empathy to their privileged children overcame the objections. The ceremony marking the successful completion of Michael's first semester was small. Robert insisted on intimacy over a media spectacle, but it was laden with a significance that transcended the simplicity of the event. Old Man Joe was there, wearing a suit for the first time in 15 years, his beard now trimmed and his grey hair combed. Having already worked for 3 months as the manager of the Robert Anderson Welcome Center, which opened with a capacity for 200 people and a waiting list of 500, Lourdes cried tears of maternal joy. Her health dramatically improved after months of proper medical treatment that revealed and treated undiagnosed diabetes and chronic hypertension. James, now studying to be a nursing assistant and living in a student dorm, filmed everything on the phone he received to keep in touch with his street family that was no longer on the street. Robert made a point of giving a short speech, not for an external audience, but for the small group that represented his tortuous path from cynicism to imperfect redemption. I spent 30 days on the streets looking to confirm my cynical belief that humanity was dead, that no one really cared about strangers when the cost was real, and in 847 interactions, my hypothesis seemed confirmed, until a 9-year-old boy who had absolutely nothing decided to risk everything. His voice faltered briefly, emotion breaking through the trained composure of an executive. Michael proved me wrong in the most painful and beautiful way possible. And now, 6 months later, I have the honor of seeing that same boy not just surviving but thriving, proving that potential doesn't depend on a zip code or a bank account. Michael, asked to speak, stood up shyly in front of the small group, his small hands clutching the completion certificate as if it were a fragile treasure. "I've learned a lot in these 6 months," he began, his voice still childish, but carrying a maturity that came from experience no child should have. "I learned math, English, history, but the most important thing I learned came from Joe a long time ago. Dignity has no price. When I was in that alley, I didn't think I was going to get money or an apartment. I just thought that letting a person get beaten up when I could do something, even if it was just yelling, was wrong." He paused, looking directly at Robert. "I still don't know if I've completely forgiven you for using me as a test, but I know that what you're doing now is helping a lot of people. So maybe forgiveness isn't a yes or no. Maybe it's a process." The transformation was not limited to Michael and his street family, but expanded in concentric circles, touching lives in ways no strategic plan could have predicted. Robert shut down his company for an entire week, a decision that cost millions in productivity, to have all 847 employees do volunteer work at institutions serving vulnerable populations, requiring every executive to spend a minimum of 3 days living an experience of proximity to poverty that most had never had. Initial resistance gave way to genuine transformations. The CFO, who complained about the waste of time, ended up becoming a permanent volunteer mentor for at-risk youth. The marketing director launched a pro bono campaign for NGOs. Dozens of employees started regular monthly donations and volunteering. The Robert Anderson Welcome Center, managed by Joe with an efficiency that surprised even the most experienced social workers, became a nationally referenced model for how to combine dignity with practical assistance. Unlike traditional shelters that treated beneficiaries like numbers or problems, the center operated under a philosophy that Joe summarized simply: street folks don't just need a roof, they need respect. Individual rooms instead of dehumanizing communal halls, customized vocational training programs, non-judgmental psychological support, and crucially, the involvement of former homeless individuals at all levels of management. No one understands what the homeless population needs better than those who've lived it. Joe would explain to journalists who came to document the innovative project. Within a year, 67% of the residents had secured stable employment and permanent housing. Robert aggressively expanded the model, announcing a plan to build similar centers in 50 American cities over the next 5 years, a total investment estimated at $400 million that would be the largest private program to combat homelessness in the country's history. Critics, and there were many, especially among activists wary of billionaire philanthropic solutions for structural problems, correctly pointed out that charity is no substitute for adequate public policy, and that Robert was essentially buying positive PR after having literally used a vulnerable child as an experiment. These criticisms were valid, and Robert did not deny them. "They're right," he admitted in an interview with a business magazine. "Philanthropy doesn't solve systemic inequality, but while we push for structural change, people are dying on the streets today. So we do both. We help now, and we fight for systemic transformation." 2 years after that cold August night that changed so many trajectories, Michael, now 11 but finally looking his age after proper nutrition, allowed for catch-up growth, stood on the stage of the first Welcome Center, greeting a new group of 5 children who had just come off the streets. He volunteered there every Saturday, not because Robert asked him to or because he had to, but because he felt a responsibility to extend the hand that had been extended to him. One of the new girls, maybe 7 years old, looked around with the traumatized suspicion of someone who has learned that adults lie and promises are broken, her dark eyes carrying a sadness too ancient for a child. Michael recognized that look because it had been his 2 years ago. He knelt to be at her eye level, remembering how adults always seemed like threatening giants when he was on the streets, and smiled with the gentleness Joe had shown him when he needed it most. "Welcome," Michael said in a calm, unhurried voice. "I know you're scared. I know you think this won't last, that someone will kick you out or that something bad will happen. I thought so too. But it's different here. You're home now." The girl didn't respond, still trapped in her protective shell of mistrust, but her eyes softened slightly, and Michael saw a microscopic glimmer of hope trying to sprout through the dry soil of trauma. And in that moment, observing that tiny but infinitely significant transformation, Michael understood that the cycle of kindness Joe had started with him was now continuing through him. And so, the cycle continues, expanding in waves that touch lives in ways both measurable and immeasurably profound. A child invisible to society became the light that illuminated the darkness of collective hypocrisy, forcing millions to confront the uncomfortable question, how many times have we turned our heads when we could have helped? The story of Michael and Robert is not a simple tale of hero and villain, but a complex narrative about human fallibility, imperfect redemption, and the transformative power of choosing humanity, even when it costs everything. Michael didn't need to be rich to have a heart of gold, and Robert discovered that all his wealth couldn't buy what that boy possessed naturally: the moral courage to do the right thing when no one was watching and nothing was compelling him. If this story touched your heart, if it made you question your own choices when you pass by vulnerable people on the streets, then share it. Because maybe, just maybe, it will inspire someone else to make a difference too. In the end, as Michael proved on that cold August night, it doesn't matter how much money we have in the bank or how many academic degrees hang on our walls. What matters is how much love we have the courage to give when giving means risking something. It matters if we choose to see when it's easier to feign invisibility. It matters if we prioritize human dignity above personal convenience. And it matters if we decide that every life has value, regardless of address, bank account, or appearance. Thank you for following this story to the end. If you believe that stories like this need to be told, that we need to confront our complicity in social invisibility, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment, "I would make a difference too." Because in the end, we are defined not by what we say we believe, but by what we do when believing costs something real. Michael chose humanity when he was 9 years old with nothing in his pocket. And you? When confronted with the choice between the comfort of indifference and the vulnerability of compassion, what will you choose? The answer to that question defines not only who we are individually, but what kind of society we build collectively. Choose well.